Hi, welcome to Serial Binger. You are listening to The Legend of the Northern Blade. Happy binging. Jin Muwon opened his eyes. Oddly, the world seemed to have become a blur. That was because a layer of moisture had covered his young eyes. Although he was trying his best to hold it in, the tears would not stop flowing, as if his tear ducts were damaged. Jin Muwon wiped away the tears with his sleeve. "This is the last time I will cry. I will never shed tears ever again," swore the 13-year-old teenager to himself. Just then, a man stretched out a large hand and stroked Jin Muwon on the head. The boy raised his head to look at the man. Behind the gentle smile on the man's face, one could faintly sense his sorrow and despair. The man knelt down and made eye contact with Jin Muwon. "Son, from now on you will be alone." "Father. I'm sorry. Do you know why you have to apologize to me?" The man nodded and grabbed Jin Muwon's shoulder. "So you do understand. I'm sorry, but from now on, you are the Lord of the Northern Army." Jin Muwon nodded in response as the man silently patted him on the shoulder. The man could feel his son's shoulder shivering. No matter how mature the boy was, he was still a 13-year-old child who needed his parents' protection. Jin Muwon looked up at the sky and avoided the man's gaze, trying his hardest not to tear up again. "Damn it. You're the last head of a family that has fallen apart. Just what kind of shitty inheritance are you leaving me, huh?" "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. Apologies don't suit a great man like my father." "I see. It seems that for a moment, I forgot who I was." The man stood up, back straight. His name was Jin Kwon-ho, also known as the Northern Wall. To some, he was the Wall of Despair, but to others he was the most dependable shield. The word "sorry" did not suit a man like that. "Do you hate me? This is all my fault." "It's fine. At least, I no longer have to be restrained by duty. I'm free from all the responsibilities now." "I'm glad you think that way." Jin Kwon-ho nodded and looked outside the room. There were a lot of people in the central plaza. They were waiting for Jin Kwon-ho to come out. "It's time. I shouldn't disappoint those people. If possible, I wish this was an illusion, but alas." Jin Kwon-ho's calm voice made Jin Muwon's eyes twitch. Jin Muwon bit his lip. His tender lip split open and blood flowed out from the wound, but he still stared at Jin Kwon-ho as if it didn't hurt at all. "Father." As Jin Kwon-ho walked out, Jin Muwon followed behind him. Jin Kwon-ho's back was wider and stronger than any other. Jin Muwon imprinted the image of his father's back in his mind. As he entered the central plaza, Jin Muwon looked at the army who had gathered there. There were people of all ages and dressed in different styles of clothing. The only thing they had in common was the sharpness in their eyes, which was proof that they were all martial arts experts. Right now, the only thing preventing these people from moving forward were a few warriors still loyal to the north. However, they were just candles in the wind in front of these experts. Their sharp gazes fell on Jin Kwon-ho. Jin Kwon-ho locked gazes with them one at a time. Among them were soldiers who immediately looked away, as if they were guilty of a grave crime. There were some, though, who glared back at Jin Kwon-ho with killing intent. These included some people that Jin Kwon-ho and Jin Muwon had been very close to. Jin Kwon-ho whispered to himself, "It seems that martial artists from all over have gathered here today. Should I think of this as an honor?" It was true, all the strongest martial artists in the Murim had gathered in the same plaza. Several stood out much more than others. 9 martial artists stood at the head of the army. The youngest was a warrior in his 30s and the oldest, a monk in his 70s. Overwhelming auras far exceeding the others could be felt emanating from their bodies. Only those who stood at the very top could possess such intimidating auras. Jin Kwon-ho looked at them coldly and said, as expected, Heaven's summit is behind all of this. I can't help but be impressed. Jean Quan Ho. A man in his 60s stepped forward. He had an ordinary appearance that would blend perfectly into any crowd, but his eyes were as deep as the ocean. Most people dared not face this man's gaze, because they'd feel like he could see right through them. Grand Elder of the Xiaomun clan, the renowned Ghost of Zhuge Liang. Jean Quan Ho recognized this old man immediately. The old man's real name was Xiaomun Hua. He was a genius who had brought a clan of fallen nobles back to prominence. It was said that he had reached the limits of knowledge and understood every law of nature. All the wisdom of the world was contained within that tiny brain of his. He had passed the role of family head down to his son and became the Grand Elder of the clan as well as one of the 9 skies of heaven's summit. This day, Xiaomun Hua and the other 8 members of the 9 skies overshadowed the sky of the north. Why did you betray us, Jean Quan Ho? I have no idea what you mean, Elder Xiaomun. Are you going to keep denying what you've done? You colluded with our enemy, the Silent Knight. Ha! Xiaomun, how are you so proud of a life of corruption? You're even falsely accusing me of colluding with the Silent Knight. That's ridiculous. The 4 pillars of the Northern Army have given their testimony. Are you still not going to confess? Jean Quan Ho looked at the 4 men who stood at the very back of the army. Because of the crowd, he could not see their faces clearly, but he could sense their presence. Are you 4 so ashamed that you have to hide behind others? The Northern Generals. Better known as the 4 Pillars of the North. Once, they had been Jean Quan Ho's friends. He had trusted and relied on them more than any other, and they had been the North's shields and spears. In the end though, they had chosen to betray Jean Quan Ho and the Northern Army. Many followers of the Northern Army had also joined them in betrayal. You're pathetic. Suddenly, Jean Quan Ho turned toward Jean Muwan, who stood beside him silently. His son was more composed and stood prouder than anyone else in the hall. However, Jean Quan Ho knew that this was all an act. Jean Muwan's trembling shoulders was proof of that. No matter how resolute he was only 13. He was far too young to calmly accept the terrible misfortune that had befallen him out of nowhere. Jean Quan Ho put a hand on Jean Muwan's shoulder. Jean Muwan raised his head and looked up at his gentle father. His son's deep black eyes spoke 1,000 words. I'm sorry, my son. Jean Quan Ho let go of his son and took a step toward Xiaomun Hua. All the members of the 9 skies, including Xiaomun Hua, flinched. No matter how much I struggle, I can't escape from your trap. Still, this is the Northern Army. If I give it up, 1/3 of this desolate region will become truly unlivable. Are you planning to resist, Jean Quan Ho? A hint of anxiety appeared on Xiaomun Hua's face. The others were just as nervous. Although it was on the verge of collapse, this was the headquarters of the Northern Army. This was the fortress that had defended against the Silent Knight for 100 years. It wouldn't be surprising if there were death traps and formations everywhere. Just those were enough to wipe out 1/3 of their forces. Most importantly, the man called Jean Quan Ho was here. If the man known as the Northern Wall charged at them while prepared to die, the number of deaths he would cause was unimaginable. The 4 pillars might have betrayed him, but there were still many experts loyal to the Northern Army. One word from Jean Quan Ho, and they would follow him to their deaths. Thus, Xiaomun Hua and the other 9 skies of heaven's summit were more nervous than ever before. Unexpectedly, Jean Quan Ho was the one who broke the tension. I will disband the Northern Army. Really? I no longer have any reason to lie. Jean Quan Ho grinned smugly at Xiaomun Hua, who scowled back with suspicion. Jean Quan Ho looked as if he knew the whole truth, which made the 9 skies' faces turn red with anger and shame that they had been trying to hide. To Jean Quan Ho, this couldn't have been an easy decision. Although it was only for a moment, the 9 skies were dumbfounded. The Northern Army must be eradicated. As long as the Northern Army exists, we will be unable to cement our control over the Central Plains. The 9 Skies exchanged thoughts. Regardless of whether he knew their true intentions, Jin Quanho cut right to the chase. He announced, from today onward, the Northern Army is no more. All warriors of the North, leave the Northern Army and live your lives as you please. This is my final order as your lord. Milord. Ah. Many warriors of the Northern Army, who had been facing off against the Murim's forces, chose to commit suicide upon hearing Jin Quanho's announcement. As they embraced their deaths, tears flooded uncontrollably from their eyes. Jin Quanho turned back to look at Xiao Moonhua. Are you satisfied now? It seems that this still isn't enough for you. Jin Quanho's grin widened. To these people, there was only one acceptable outcome. Jin Quanho decided to give them what they wanted. Ha! Jin Quanho released his aura and a powerful windstorm engulfed the area. The 9 Skies raised their weapons and prepared to work together to fight him. Just as his aura reached its pinnacle, Jin Quanho suddenly turned his strength on himself. His body shook from the great impact. Father! Jin Muwan ran toward his fallen father and held him in his arms. His clothes were quickly drenched in Jin Quanho's blood. Ah! The 9 Skies heaved sighs of relief. They all knew what Jin Quanho had done to himself. By reversing the flow of his qi, all of Jin Quanho's blood vessels had burst. With damaged coronary arteries, not even the gods could save Jin Quanho now. Jin Quanho looked toward Xiao Moonhua with bloodshot eyes from the burst blood vessels. Satisfied, now? Everyone in the Murim army, including Xiao Moonhua, were stunned speechless by Jin Quanho's bloodied appearance. The man had chosen to end his own life rather than die fighting. Jin Quanho's extreme decision made even toughened soldiers break down in shock. Even Xiao Moonhua bit his lip in consternation. Xiao Moonhua's eyes fell upon Jin Muwan. I wished to die surrounded only by my family. It was hard for Xiao Moonhua to look away, but if he did not, the soldiers would disapprove of him. All of you, get out, cried Xiao Moonhua. Jin Quanho smiled weakly in his son's arms. His heart had been torn to shreds and there was no sign of life on his pale face. He had persisted this far using his powerful qi, but he had finally reached his limit. I'm sorry, my son. Father. I hope you live freely. Jin Quanho passed away, smiling. Jin Muwan stared at his father's face for a very long time. Although his father had died from a damaged heart, his face appeared the same in death as it did in life. Jin Muwan stretched out a trembling hand and closed his father's eyes. Jin Muwan carried his father's corpse and turned around. I'm all alone now. Alone under the wavering, endless sky. The soldiers quietly stared at Jin Muwan's lanky profile. This young man, who had not shed even a single teardrop at his father's death, gave them a strange sense of trepidation. Winters in the north were harsh. The merciless dry winds would penetrate right through one's clothes and sting like blades cutting into flesh. 2 horse-drawn wagons plodded slowly across the plains against the punishing wind. A dozen or so men sat both inside and on the roof of the wagons. They looked around them, faces pale. They were exhausted from their long journey. They were not in a hurry, so the journey had not been physically tiring, but the countless days spent on the road still pushed their mental resilience to their limits. The worst thing was that no matter which direction they looked in, all they saw was an endless, flat expanse of snow. It's been 3 days since we left the border, but I haven't seen a single living soul. It feels like I've entered a completely different world, like I'm suffocating in a blanket of white nothingness. Do we seriously have to spend 3 years in this desolate place? Muttered a man sitting on the roof of one of the wagons to himself. The men around him closed their eyes and shuddered at the thought. The wagon they were riding on was filled with food and daily necessities that they would need to survive the harsh winter. With this much food, they couldn't possibly go hungry, but even that was not enough to make them feel better about their situation. A large fortress appeared in the distance. At first glance, it was grand and imposing, with the soaring towers of a few dozen stately palaces peeking over the colossal walls. On closer inspection though, the eerie fortress showed no signs of human life, like it had been abandoned a long time ago. This was the place they would be staying in for the next 3 years. They were approaching their destination, but the men's motivation was at an all-time low. Fuck. When he saw his dispirited men, the captain of the group stomped his feet angrily, but said nothing more. That was because he was just as depressed as the rest of them. His name was Jiang Pei-san. He was the captain of the 3rd Company of mercenaries affiliated with Heaven's Summit. The men on the wagons were all his underlings. As they approached the main gate, Jiang Pei-san shouted to his men, "We will soon be taking over custody of the fortress from the 2nd Company, so buck up. Don't you dare embarrass me in front of those guys." "Yes, sir." In front of the fierce, bandit-like Jiang Pei-san, even the toughest, strongest men would become meek and obedient. Jiang Pei-san had an explosive, violent temper that made his men tread carefully around him so as not to trigger the volcanic eruption of empty Jiang Pei-san. The vice-captain Xiao Musang stood up on a wagon roof and ordered, "Everyone check your weapons." Xiao Musang was a young man in his early 20s, with a calm and rational personality. Due to the fact that he never showed any emotions, the men gossiped about his cold-bloodedness. Xiao Musang raised his head and looked at the main gate of the fortress. The large plaque that had once stood there and displayed the name of the fortress was nowhere to be seen. The gate itself had fallen into disrepair and was covered in numerous cracks and dents. Fortunately, the walls were still intact enough to distinguish the interior and exterior of the fortress. There was a strange inscription on the walls, but no one thought much of those. During the climax of the war with the Silent Night, this fortress had housed more than 10,000 soldiers from all over the Central Plains. There were dozens of identical military barracks, nameless villas and other essential facilities for living. More people lived here in the Northern Army fortress than in an entire county. In fact, this fortress was so big that even those who had lived here for many years could easily lose their sense of direction within the maze-like fortress and become hopelessly lost. As a result, the Northern Army used to hand out maps to everyone who was visiting for the first time. However, these once majestic buildings now lay in ruins, reduced to a mere shadow of their former selves. "Is this really the Northern Army fortress?" murmured Xiao Musang. "This used to be the Northern Army fortress. It's also the place where we will be spending the next 3 years. Fuck this shit," cursed Jiang Pei-san. To him, the fact that this fortress was once the headquarters of the famed Northern Army was not important. He was simply disgusted and enraged by the thought of living in such a godforsaken place for 3 whole years. On the other hand, Xiao Musang looked at the ruins of the Northern Army fortress with a sense of reverence. Even though the Northern Army was no more, joining this army had once been the dream of many young martial artists. The sheer weight of the words, Northern Army, bore down heavily on the hearts of Xiao Musang and the other young warriors. Screech. An ear-piercing screech rang out as the rusted gates were opened. A group of men marched out from the fortress, but unlike the reminiscing young men, these people had sharp eyes and intimidating auras. Jiang Pei-san saw a familiar face amongst the men and greeted, "Captain Xiao." "Oh, who is this I see? I guess this makes you my replacement." "Captain Jiang." Captain Xiao shook hands with Jiang Pei-san. "Yeah, unfortunately." Captain Xiao clicked his tongue. He had already been stuck here for more than 2 years. Those years had been utter misery for him and his men. Thus, he had been really looking forward to going home. Today, the day of his departure had finally arrived. The feelings of the men of the 2nd and 3rd companies were the exact opposite. The former were excited and the latter, depressed. For the 3rd company, the gates to hell had just opened and were welcoming them to a long period of suffering and despair. Captain Seo put a hand on Jiang Peisan's shoulder and hurried him along. "Let's go inside." Jiang Peisan and the rest of the third company followed Captain Seo, while the second company escorted the wagons into the fortress. From inside, the Northern Army fortress appeared even shabbier than it did when seen from outside. The main buildings were barely intact, and most of the secondary buildings had completely collapsed. In addition, any pieces of evidence of human civilization were gradually being eroded by the green of nature. There were only a few usable buildings amongst the ruins. Jiang Peisan noticed a well-maintained mansion in the innermost part of the fortress. "Is that the one?" "Yes, that's the prison." "Prison?" "Then." Captain Seo nodded silently. After receiving his confirmation, Jiang Peisan saw the mansion in a completely different light. The third company also followed their captain's gaze and looked toward the mansion. Suddenly, the door to the mansion opened, accompanied by the creaking of rusted hinges. A scrawny teenage boy about 15 to 16 years of age walked out. The boy's shoulder-length black hair was untied, and long bangs covered his eyes. The only parts of his face that could be seen were his nose, lips, and chin. Jiang Peisan felt that this boy ought to have a very stubborn personality from his sharp nose and pursed lips. Even if he didn't look like that, the boy exuded the aura of a lone wolf. That was not an aura that a 15, 16-year-old boy should have. It fit him unexpectedly well though. Captain Seo and the second company tensed up when they saw the boy. In contrast, Jiang Peisan and the third company appeared confused, their eyes showing hints of both pity and wariness. Captain Seo moved to intercept the boy, saying, "You have to inform us beforehand if you want to go out." The boy stopped in his tracks and looked at the captain. At least, it seemed that he was looking at the captain, as his eyes were hidden under his hair. The captain felt that he could somehow sense the boy's gaze. After staring at the captain for a while, the boy finally said, "I'm just taking a walk. I'm not going out today." The boy's voice was very soft, barely more than a whisper. One would think that unless one was paying attention, one would not have heard him. But despite the low volume, the boy's words could be easily understood. Everyone, even the men of the third company standing far away, could hear the boy, not just Captain Seo who was right in front of him. Even so, no one found this odd. Perhaps that was because of the boy's unique aura. "I believe you." The boy nodded at Captain Seo's reply and left. None of the soldiers could take their eyes off his back as he walked away. Only when the boy had disappeared around a corner did Jiang Peisan ask, "Was that the kid?" "Yes. He is the last heir of the Northern Army." The boy paused for a moment and surveyed his surroundings. The fortress that hadn't been maintained for 2 years had truly become a ruin. Thankfully, there were still 2 intact residential buildings left, the mansion that the boy lived in and the barracks where Heaven Summit's affiliate mercenaries lived. All other defensive and military structures had been destroyed, leaving nothing but rubble. The boy had gotten used to the desolate scenery, but nevertheless, it still pained him every time he saw it. This was the place that his father, grandfather and forefathers had worked hard to protect. The boy's name was Jin Muwan. Technically, he was the lord of the Northern Army. Since the Northern Army had been disbanded in disgrace, calling him the lord was a form of humiliation. After the events of 2 years ago, none of the former warriors had chosen to remain and had all departed for greener pastures. Heaven Summit, the mastermind behind the Northern Army's destruction, was flourishing right in the heart of the Central Plains. Many sects that had once been loyal to the Northern Army now pledged their allegiances to the factions led by the Four Pillars of the North. Even martial artists living outside the Four Pillars domains knew how lucrative employment there was. "Where did all of you go? I hope you have enough to eat and are living happily," laughed Jin Muwan self-deprecatingly. He despised the people who had chosen to leave the Northern Army. The Northern Army had been created with the help of Heaven's Summit and had also been annihilated in the hands of the same Heaven's Summit. His father had been too kind to force all of the Northern Army's warriors to commit mass suicide with him, and had ordered them to leave instead. Even so, I didn't think that all of you would move so far away. Jin Muwan scratched his head. He was unable to leave this place. Even if the Northern Army had fallen, he was still its lord. A lord cannot forsake his territory. Jin Muwan sighed. No matter how hard I try, I can't help but sigh. Following the death of Jin Quanho and the disbandment of the Northern Army was no longer a threat to Heaven's Summit. The people who had lost their livelihood felt like they had no choice but to move away. But just because they had given up, did not mean that Jin Muwan had given up. Using keeping a lookout for the Silent Night as an excuse, Heaven's Summit had sent its affiliate mercenaries to the Northern Army fortress. Officially, he was the landlord and the second company were his tenants. However, no one had seen hide nor hair of the Silent Night for 30 years. The whole world believed that the Silent Night had been completely destroyed and that the Northern Army had been disbanded because there was no longer any need for its existence as the main force defending the front lines. The mercenaries' real job was not to keep an eye on the Silent Night, it was to keep an eye on the last heir to the Northern Army. Jin Muwan wandered aimlessly around the wreckage. After the events of that day, the enemy had not immediately left the fortress. The four pillars took the most valuable military supplies. Gold and other valuables were plundered in an instant. Even weapons like swords and dao had been looted. It was all thanks to those thieves that Jin Muwan was penniless. I don't know what will happen in the future, but no matter what, I will survive. Jin Muwan shook his head. He was only 15, an age where most would still be depending on their parents, but he had matured so quickly that he felt like an old man. Jin Muwan walked into a tower that still possessed a roof. In the past, this tower was known as the Grand Library. The library had been named after the 10,000 precious scholarly tomes and martial arts manuals that had once been stored here. This ruined tower could no longer live up to its name as the Grand Library. Most of the precious tomes had been scattered all over the world, leaving only a few worthless ones behind. The 100 or so books left could be classified into two categories: philosophy books and third-rate martial arts manuals, example 6 Directions Fist, 3 Foundations of Swordsmanship, Cloud Steps. They were all placed on the same bookshelf. Jin Muwan stood in front of the bookshelf and took out the 3 Foundations of Swordsmanship manual. Just as the world is split into the heavens, the earth, and man, so is swordsmanship. This line seemed sophisticated, but all the manual contained were the 3 basics of using a sword. It was so simple that no martial artist worth his salt would call it swordsmanship. Jin Muwan knew the truth about the book. Even so, he read it seriously again and again in order to fully understand the 3 foundations of swordsmanship. He was so focused that it took him half an hour to finish reading a book with only a few pages. There was nothing much to do in this barren land, and the mercenaries never interacted with him. Time passed so slowly that each unchanging day felt like a year. Reading was one of the few activities that took up a lot of time, so Jin Muwan visited the Grand Library daily and read each book over and over again. By now he had memorized the contents of all the books, down to every word. Nevertheless, when the next day arrived, he would read a memorized book again. There was nothing else to do anyway. Heaven's Summit was afraid that Jin Muwan would learn martial arts and take revenge on them, so they dispatched mercenaries to observe him. But after observing Jin Muwan closely for 2 years, Captain Seo and his men concluded, there was no martial art manual left for Jin Muwan to learn from. Wow, these people are seriously greedy. They took away everything except the truly worthless trash. I guess being thick-skinned and shameless is also a kind of talent, said Jin Muwan to himself. Whenever he was alone, Jin Muwan would talk to himself. If he didn't do that, he'd probably never get the opportunity to talk. Jin Muwan put the manual back on the shelf. Normally, he would then take out another book and begin reading, but he didn't feel like doing that today. He left the grand library and headed toward his mansion. Just then, a powerful gust of wind nearly swept him off his feet. Winter had begun, bringing with it the raging tempests of the north. Seo Musang looked coldly at the mansion in the distance. It was the most well-preserved building in the ruins of the Northern Army fortress as well as Jin Muwan's lodgings. "You mean to say that you're supposed to stay here for 3 whole years?" asked Captain Seo. The second company had lived here for 2 years. The third company would have to be here for 3. The mercenaries' main objective was to keep watch for any movements from the Silent Night, but the possibility of that happening was very low. The first time the Silent Night revealed themselves was 130 years ago. Their appearance ignited the fires of war across the continent. Countless people died, to the point where cities, towns and villages started to appear lifeless. Only when the Silent Night disappeared and the war ended did the people begin to regain their vitality and prosperity. After the end of the First War, the Silent Night staged a new invasion every 5 to 10 years. Each invasion resulted in a huge battle that claimed countless lives. As the casualties piled up, the Murim world decided to work together to defend against the Silent Night. The Northern Army was the culmination of their efforts. It was not a sect or school but a new army comprised of martial artists from the entire Murim who were united in a single purpose, to defeat the Silent Night. The Murim spared no expense in supporting the Northern Army. This resulted in the Northern Army amassing a large collection of martial arts and precious medicines, which was used to create a legion of elite martial artists. The duty of these elites was to protect the people from the Silent Night. And then there was Heaven's Summit. Heaven's Summit was originally an alliance created to financially support the Northern Army. The first leaders of Heaven's Summit included the heads and elders of many clans, but as time passed, 9 clans rose to prominence. The leaders of these 9 clans became the first generation 9 skies of Heaven's Summit. Seo Munwa was one of them. The 9 skies of Heaven's Summit created a new world order by taking advantage of the chaos that the Silent Night had sowed, effectively becoming the new rulers of the Murim. This state of affairs continued until 30 years ago, when the Silent Night suddenly disappeared. The most commonly believed reason for the disappearance was that an entire generation of the Silent Night's members had been wiped out. To regain their strength, the Silent Night would need many years to nurture a new generation of martial artists. With this knowledge in hand, Heaven's Summit decided to completely eradicate the Silent Night whilst they were still weakened. The biggest obstacle to Heaven's Summit then became the Northern Army. Heaven's Summit felt that the continued existence of the Silent Night had become an excuse for the Northern Army to retain its power, and that the Northern Army would oppose their plans for the complete destruction of the Silent Night. Thus, they came up with a scheme to fake evidence of Jin Quanho's collusion with the Silent Night, which would, in turn, bring about the disbandment of the Northern Army. Despite the fact that everyone had left the Northern Army, leaving only a boy named Jin Muwan behind, Heaven's Summit remained wary of the possibility of the Northern Army's resurrection. The mercenaries' true mission was to constantly monitor Jin Muwan's every action. Heaven's Summit wanted to investigate whether Jin Muwan knew and practiced martial arts and if he had any desire for vengeance. The moment they confirmed that he was a threat, he would be taken away by the mercenaries. Over the last 2 years, we've established that the boy poses no threat to Heaven's Summit. Even so, I have to stay here for 3 years, said Seo Musang, frowning. Keeping watch for the Silent Night sounded like an honorable job, but in reality, they might as well have been exiled. A familiar voice said, "Vice Captain, what are you doing there all alone?" Seo Musang turned around to see 2 men, one in his early to mid-20s and the other just past 30 years of age. Their names were Yu Jiangchun and Won Jixim, and they were the people he got along best with within the third company. Seo Musang turned to face the direction of Jin Muwan's mansion in reply. Won Jixim and Yu Jiang-chun caught onto his intentions immediately and nodded in understanding. They felt the same way as Seo Musang. "Why not just kill the boy?" whispered Won Jixim. "What? If the target of our mission dies, we won't have to live here for 3 years. We'll definitely be summoned back to the Central Plains." Seo Musang and Yu Jiang-chun shook their heads at Won Jixim's joke. Although it was in bad taste, they could see why he would think that way. Seo Musang coldly and firmly said, "Our job is to keep watch for any movements from the Silent Night, and nothing else." "But Hyung, you agree with me, right? What I think isn't important. I'm just obeying orders from above." "Still. If you dare repeat what you just suggested, then I'm no longer your Hyung." "Okay, okay." Won Jixim lowered his head, sulking. Yu Jiang-chun noticed him and clicked his tongue. "You're always like this. Someday, you're going to have to pay for that uncontrollable tongue of yours." "I get it already. This is all my mouth's fault, so from now on I'll just have to keep it shut." Yu Jiang-chun smiled. "You say that, but a few minutes later you'll start chattering away again." Won Jixim was a talkative man who loved to make jokes. He wouldn't stop talking even if he got scolded for it. As expected, Won Jixim couldn't stay quiet for long, and had the 3 men roaring with laughter not long later. Elsewhere, Jang Peisan and Captain Seo were drinking together. For Captain Seo, tonight was his last night at the Northern Army fortress. For Jang Peisan, tonight would be his first night here. Each had their own feelings about this big change in their life. Jang Peisan poured a drink for Captain Seo and asked, "Got any plans after returning to the Central Plains? Do I have a choice? I just do whatever my superiors order me to." "You should be receiving a huge reward for staying here for 2 whole years, right?" "Right," mumbled Captain Seo. Just as Jang Peisan had mentioned, he would be receiving a large reward for his service, but he hadn't been informed what that reward would be yet. The two continued pouring drinks for each other. A few rounds later, both of them had gotten slightly drunk. Only then did Jang Peisan reveal his true intentions. "So, how much did you take?" "What? Are you going to keep acting stupid? We're friends, right? Didn't all of the most precious resources in the world get sent here during the war? Don't tell me that you didn't take any of that for yourself, and are surviving on the pittance that we get for work." Captain Seo did not reply immediately. He first finished a cup of wine and then chewed on a piece of pork. The Northern Army used up all the consumable resources themselves. The rest of the treasure has already been taken away by Heaven's Summit and the former generals. As for me, I received nothing. "Really? Are you sure you're not hiding something from me?" "Trust me, I spent 2 years searching every nook and cranny of this ruin, but I found nothing." Jang Peisan scowled. This was not the answer he was expecting. If everything was taken, then how is the penniless boy still alive? He's got a servant. A man who took it upon himself to feed the kid. What about martial arts? Did you manage to force any martial art techniques out of him? No, the kid has never practiced any martial art before. Even if he didn't practice it, he could have still memorized it, right? I thought the same way at first, but the kid was only 13 at that time. How much could he have memorized at that age? I even heard that the martial arts of the Northern Army are unusually complex and that it's not possible for one person to remember it all, much less master everything. In addition, the 4 pillars who literally raised the boy gave testimony that he had never learned nor practiced any form of martial art. In truth, Jin Muwon was only alive today because of the testimony from the 4 pillars. They could tell at a glance that Jin Quanho had not taught his son martial arts. If Jin Quanho had indeed taught his martial art to his son, Jin Muwon would have already been executed. Jang Peisan was clearly upset after his conversation with Captain Seo, but the dark glint in his eyes strongly hinted that he was not a man who would give up easily. The next morning, Captain Seo and the second company departed the Northern Army fortress. Jiang Peisan and the third company watched them leave. At that moment, the relaxed smiles on the faces of the second company stood in stark contrast to the frowning, gloomy third company. "Fuck," cursed someone. Jiang Peisan yelled back, "What are all of you still doing here? Get back to work." The third company immediately started returning to their posts. "Vice Captain Seo, stay behind." "Yes, sir. I have a mission for you." Seo Musang looked at Jiang Peisan quietly. Jiang Peisan suddenly broke into a huge grin, revealing his yellowed teeth. "Vice Captain, don't you feel bad about spending 3 years here rotting away?" "Yes." "Then, since you can't get away from this place, you might as well profit from it, yeah?" "But didn't the second company say that all the treasure was gone? There's nothing left for us to take." "That's what they said." "Think carefully, do you trust them? What if there was a little bit of hidden treasure left? You want me to search for hidden treasure? The Northern Army has existed for 100 years. Why wouldn't they have hidden treasure? Why do you think the boy is being kept alive? He must know something." The second company observed the boy for 2 years. They discovered nothing. That's where you, my smart vice captain, come into play. I can't trust what the others say, because they're all idiots. I need you to get close to the boy. Jiang Peisan knew how cold and emotionless Seo Musang was. It was hard to get along with him, but he was the best man for the job. The boy will definitely talk once he considers you an ally. What if he still doesn't reveal anything? Jiang Peisan grinned cruelly, sending a shiver down Seo Musang's spine. Then we'll simply have to torture him. But we were specifically ordered not to mess with the boy. How would those guys living on the other side of the continent know the truth of what happened here? We just have to report that the boy went out of the fortress for a walk and came back injured. Heaven's Summit will accept any excuse as long as it's plausible. We could also kill him afterwards to shut him up, and then say he died in an accident, laughed Jiang Peisan. Seo Musang finally nodded, even though he felt utterly disgusted by Jiang Peisan's greed and depravity. As a mercenary, he had been demoted again and again until finally, he ended up at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the third company. He had already been backed into a corner and had nothing left to lose. He didn't know if a hidden treasure truly existed, but at least it would help him kill some time. Jin Muwan. Seo Musang couldn't help but look toward the mansion where Jin Muwan lived. Jin Muwan went for a walk. It was part of his daily routine. Every morning, he would take a walk around the Northern Army fortress, strolling around leisurely like a tourist. Seo Musang secretly tailed Jin Muwan. All was as Jiang Peisan had said, the boy showed no sign of ever having practiced martial arts. The walking gait of a martial artist was different from that of a normal person. Jin Muwan's breathing was light and his footsteps heavy, typical of a person who didn't possess any qi. After walking for a short while, Jin Muwan would stop to rest and catch his breath. It seemed that he wasn't very fit. Regardless, he had a well-proportioned body with unusually long limbs, a good build for a martial artist. It's far too late for him to start learning martial arts now. Jin Muwan was already 15. He was at the age where most children of large martial clans began to shine. These children would have started learning martial arts around the age of 6 or 7, but only around age 15 when they were allowed to do muscle training would they be able to match adults in strength. They also would have been taking medication and receiving treatment since they were born to make their bodies more suited to qi cultivation. Jin Muwan, being the son of a criminal, was at a huge disadvantage compared to these kids. Even if he started learning martial arts now, he would probably never catch up to them. Jin Muwan suddenly sat down in the ruins of a pavilion near the north side entrance. "Who are you waiting for?" muttered Seo Musang to himself. hiding in the shadow of the trees where Jin Muwan couldn't see him. After what seemed like hours, Xiao Musang thought, how long have I been hiding here? Finally, he saw a man approaching the entrance. Young master. The man appeared to be in his 30s, although his slightly hunched back and tanned skin might have made him look older than he really was. Jin Muwan broke into a welcoming smile. Uncle Huang. Young master, cried the man, whose name was Huang Qiol. Huang Qiol had once been a third-rate soldier in the Northern Army. He was never any good at martial arts, but his loyalty was unquestionable. He was also the only soldier who hadn't truly abandoned the Northern Army. He voluntarily chose to spend the hard-earned money he got from working elsewhere on food and necessities for Jin Muwan, and would deliver them in person regularly. His devotion earned him the honor of being called uncle by Jin Muwan. Young master, how have you been lately? Have the new mercenaries been treating you well? Don't worry, Uncle Huang, they haven't harmed me. How have you been? I'm doing well, thank you. Huang Qiol looked at Jin Muwan sadly. He was also an orphan. When he was young, he used to always get falsely accused of crimes, so he ended up wandering from place to place. That ended when he met Jin Muwan's father, Jin Quanho. Not only was Jin Quanho the first person to accept him, he took him in, taught him martial arts, and gave him the ability to make a living. Huang Qiol never had any talent in martial arts. He couldn't even master the basics of the Northern Army's martial arts. Despite that, Jin Quanho personally taught him self-defense so that he could protect himself and live independently. Of course, he could never compare to the elites. His lack of talent was just too large of a barrier. But he was still good enough at martial arts that people called it a miracle. Huang Qiol never forgot Jin Quanho's kindness. While everyone else abandoned the Northern Army, he chose to serve Jin Muwan instead. Have you had dinner yet? Huang Qiol opened his backpack. A few moments later, a bowl of freshly cooked rice with steamy side dishes appeared in front of Jin Muwan. Huang Qiol had probably just finished cooking. The weather is cold today, so please eat while the food is hot, young master. Uncle Huang, you don't have to do this for me. I can cook for myself. No, young master, I enjoy cooking for you. Hurry and eat. Jin Muwan found himself unable to reject Huang Qiol's sincerity, so he grabbed a spoon. He suggested sharing the food with Huang Qiol but was refused. Huang Qiol said that he would feel full just watching Jin Muwan eat. Jin Muwan felt a little choked from gratitude, but still went ahead and swallowed his food. Huang Qiol was always like this. Xiao Musang twitched. He had watched this entire scene unfold from his hiding spot, and was starting to feel guilty for spying on the touching reunion between a young heir of fallen nobility and his loyal servant. The greedy Jiang Peisan now seemed so petty compared to these two sincere people. After Jin Muwan finished his dinner, Huang Qiol went to rest in the mansion, while Jin Muwan headed to the Grand Library to kill time. Since Jin Muwan wasn't in his room, Xiao Musang went to search through all of his books, but didn't find anything of interest. Was this really the headquarters of the Northern Army? The great Northern Army that single-handedly stopped the Silent Knight's invasion? Once, it had been every young man's dream to serve the Northern Army. The Northern Army had been like a utopia to those who dreamed of becoming a hero, including Xiao Musang. However, the higher one's hopes were, the more disappointed one would feel when those hopes were dashed. Disappointment would then turn into chagrin, and chagrin into hatred. The light of guilt vanished from Xiao Musang's eyes as he recalled his hatred for Jin Muwan. Jin Muwan opened the door to his room and entered. Anger flashed across his eyes for a moment as he looked across the room. Generally, it appeared the same as when he had left. However, he noticed that the placement of some objects had shifted just a little bit. A guest was here, muttered Jin Muwan as if it didn't matter to him. It was like this 2 years ago too. Captain Seo and his men would search his room again and again whenever he went out. Only after conducting more than a dozen searches did they finally give up and conclude that there was nothing of value hidden in his room. They all thought that Jin Moo-won hadn't noticed, but they had severely underestimated him. Jin Moo-won's observational skills and sharp eyesight were unparalleled. He could detect even the most subtle of changes. "I wonder how many times you guys are going to search my room this time," said Jin Moo-won to himself. He sat down at his desk and looked at the few books placed atop it, including the Tao Te Ching. He could tell that the books had been opened by another even though there were very few clues. Jin Moo-won clicked his tongue and put the books back in their original position. Later that night, when everyone else had fallen asleep, Jin Moo-won opened the window and looked outside. His room was on the third floor of the mansion, so he could see the entirety of the Northern Army fortress from his window. The days long gone were like a pleasant dream. Back then, many warriors would drink, discuss martial arts, or train late into the night. Things were lively. Now, there was only silence. Jin Moo-won stood unmoving, looking at the scenery outside. He was like a statue, making not the slightest movement. After about an hour, he shut the window and lay on his bed. He rolled around on it for a while, then began to breathe regularly as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. Swoosh! A long time after Jin Moo-won had fallen asleep, a barely perceptible swoosh sound could be heard. Jin Moo-won waited for a few minutes, then opened his eyes. "You finally left, huh?" Jin Moo-won knew that someone had been tailing him for the last few days. He even knew that he had been spied on exactly 12 times a day, his every action monitored. At first, he could feel that the spy had been pretty focused, but that concentration had waned as time passed. Jin Moo-won led a very regular lifestyle. Every morning, he would take a walk. After that, he would head to the Grand Library and read. In the evening, he would take another walk before retiring to his room. The only change today was that he had breakfast together with Huang Chiol. This unchanging routine made his life extremely boring. Such a routine was the result of his determination to survive, but at the same time it was also an unbearably painful experience for both the one following it and the one observing it. Naturally, this held true for Seo Musang as well, as he gradually lost interest in Jin Moo-won. Instead of tailing him all the time, Seo Musang would only pay attention if Jin Moo-won did something unusual. Jin Moo-won once again confirmed that his tail was gone before picking up the Tao Te Ching that currently lay beside his bed. This was the book that he would read whenever he was alone. The Tao is ever inactive, yet there is nothing it does not do. This was Jin Moo-won's favorite line in the Tao Te Ching, and also the line that best represented its contents. He sat on his bed and read the Tao Te Ching over and over again. The night was passing, and dawn would soon arrive in the north. Occasionally, Jin Moo-won would go outside the Northern Army fortress. The instant he stepped out of the entrance, he was hit by the freezing, biting wind. The wind engulfed him brutally, and before he knew it, his clothes were a mess. This wasn't a normal gale. It was a violent windstorm that felt like it could rip a person's body to pieces. The northern winds were never benevolent, so even those who had lived here for a long time would avoid going outdoors on a windy day. Jin Moo-won frowned, but did not turn back. The wind was so strong that it was hard even to breathe. Jin Moo-won let himself be assailed by the raging tempest until he began to feel pain. Pain is good. Pain is proof that I'm still alive. When the Northern Army was disbanded, time stopped for Jin Moo-won. To put it precisely, he stopped feeling the passing of time, because time spent living a life without meaning, might as well not have passed at all. For Jin Moo-won, who lived like that, the bone-chilling pain from the frigid wind was an alarm that jolted him awake from a dreary lull. It let him know that he was still alive. Jin Moo-won took a step forward. There were no settlements within 10 miles of the Northern Army fortress. In the past, the fortress had been surrounded by villages big and small. However, after the fall of the Northern Army and the departure of the villagers, all traces of their existence had been wiped out by the merciless windstorms. All he saw now was a place frozen in time, and the ruins of a once great fortress. Jin Muwon himself was a part of that bleak scene, like a still frame from an old movie. "The way you are now, Jin Muwon, is just pitiful," said Jin Muwon to himself. He climbed to the top of a nearby hill where one could get a view of the entire fortress. The top of this hill was also the highest point in the mostly flat northern region, and the place where he could see the furthest away. Jin Muwon gazed out at a place beyond the horizon. The southern region, the place everyone called the Central Plains. He had never gone there before. Standing under a tree, Jin Muwon looked toward the south for a very long time. If one looked at him now, they would see the flat northern plains reflected in his eyes. Whoosh! Jin Muwon was knocked over by a particularly powerful gale. He was simply too weak. "Well, I'm still young. In time, I will grow taller and stronger. If I manage to survive till adulthood, that is." "Ha," sighed Jin Muwon. Even thought it had only been for a moment, a look of determination had appeared on his face. Not that he wasn't usually determined. He just needed to reinforce that determination every once in a while. That was because, if he wavered, it would be equivalent to betraying his father's memory. Soon, it would finally be time for him to take the next step forward. Swish! Suddenly, he heard the sound of clothes brushing against leaves as a hand holding a black cloth reached out from behind him. MMH. Jin Muwon's eyes widened as the hand pressed the cloth over his mouth. He began to feel faint. "Hurry up." As Jin Muwon's consciousness faded away, he heard a man's impatient roar. Jin Muwon groaned as he regained consciousness. He blinked and realized that his arms had been tied. This is... He was in a small, dark room with no windows. The feel and construction of the room was familiar, so Jin Muwon deduced that he was in one of the Northern Army fortress's underground bunkers. It took you quite a while to wake up." Suddenly, a torch was lit and a man shouted right into his ear. He was temporarily blinded by the sudden bright light, but Jin Muwon recognized the speaker's voice. It was Jang Pei-san, the mercenary captain who had arrived at the fortress not long ago. Jang Pei-san was currently sitting in front of Jin Muwon. Behind him stood several members of the Third Company, including Seo Musang, Won Jiksim and Yu Jiyoung-chun. Jin Muwon immediately understood what had happened. "I was kidnapped right in my front yard." "That's right. It seems you're a smart kid. And you're Jang Pei-san." Jin Muwon glared at Jang Pei-san. Jang Pei-san grinned, revealing his ugly yellow teeth. "You got that one right too. Why did you kidnap me? You already know the answer, don't you? I want to hear it directly from your mouth. What gave you the audacity to kidnap me and throw me into a prison inside my own house?" "Ha! As I expected, you're just a harmless, naive little boy, even though you look like a venomous snake." Jang Pei-san stood up and approached Jin Muwon. Jin Muwon felt like a giant, angry wild boar was closing in on him. Jang Pei-san was just that big and fierce at 6 feet tall. Jang Pei-san grabbed Jin Muwon's chin clumsily and pulled his face close, forcing the boy to meet his gaze. "Because of a good-for-nothing like you, we have to spend 3 years rotting away. So, you have to compensate us." "You want compensation?" "Yes." "What kind of compensation are you talking about? I don't remember hiring you. Don't you work for Heaven's Summit?" "Kid, I really don't like the way you're looking at me now. It makes me want to dig your eyes out and boil them." Jang Pei-san nodded to a man behind him. The man's name was No Ji Kwang, who was the Third Company's most skilled person at torture. He was also one of Jiang Peisan's lackeys, so Jiang Peisan trusted that he would do whatever he told him to. Okay kid, let's start with the milder techniques. No Jiquang took out a scalpel with a blue-colored blade. No Jiquang lightly brushed the scalpel across the back of Jin Muwan's hand. Jin Muwan's skin split open, and blood began to flow out one drop at a time. The scalpel blade was so sharp that Jin Muwan didn't even feel any pain until he saw the blood-covered wound. Huh, groaned Jin Muwan. The pain was worse than he'd imagined, as if a nerve had been cut. I don't want to hurt you, but in my line of work, you learn to do a lot of things whether you want to or not. How to torture someone is one of them. I've never done it to a kid before, but it shouldn't be too hard to make you talk. No Jiquang placed the scalpel next to one of Jin Muwan's fingertips. The feeling of cold metal against his sensitive skin made Jin Muwan shudder, but the determination in his eyes remained undiminished. You sure you want to do this? What do you mean, kid? Do you honestly think you can get away with this? Kukuku. I don't know what you're talking about. You're an orphan, and no one will care about you even if you die here. If you really think that way, then you're a fool. No Jiquang's eyes widened at Jin Muwan's insult. He felt like he had been humiliated by the brat. Squelch. No Jiquang's hand quivered, causing the scalpel to stab into the delicate flesh right under Jin Muwan's fingernail. "Ahich!" screamed Jin Muwan, his entire body twitching and jerking like a fish out of water. His eyes turned red and swollen, and his teeth clenched together forcefully from the unbearable pain. What did you just call me? Dare to repeat yourself, kid? You are an idiot. Fuck. Furious, No Jiquang twisted the scalpel, causing Jin Muwan's fingernail to snap in half. The pain from both the broken fingernail and the scalpel digging further into his flesh was so intense that Jin Muwan couldn't even scream, only widen his eyes in shock. Xiao Musang and the others watching fervently shook their heads. I'll give you one last chance. Did you call me an idiot? Yes. You moron. You motherfucking cocky son of a bitch. No Jiquang grinned evilly. Still trembling, Jin Muwan glared at No Jiquang with bloodshot eyes. I'll tell you why you're a total dumbass. It's 'cause you don't even realize that you've taken a step closer to hell. Why, you little? Do you know why Heaven's Summit is keeping me alive? No Jiquang and Jiang Peisan hesitated for a moment. They realized that they had been so blinded by the prospect of treasure and secret martial arts that they hadn't even thought about the consequences of harming Jin Muwan. Do you think that you're smarter than the group before you? Do you honestly think that they haven't tried doing the exact same thing you're doing now? Said Jin Muwan in a grave tone, blood flowing from his cut lips. He had bitten down on his own lip really hard in order to endure the excruciating pain. Despite that, he did not forget to stare daggers at No Jiquang. The look in his eyes was so cold and frightening that even No Jiquang was taken aback. Jiang Peisan was unmoved, though. He stepped forward. Are you trying to threaten me, brat? Don't bother, your threats don't work on me. If you don't want to suffer more, hurry up and tell us where you hid the treasure. The longer you resist, the more painful this is going to be. Do I sound like I'm threatening you? Like I said, your threats mean nothing to me. Boiling with rage, Jiang Peisan nodded at No Jiquang again. That was the signal to continue with the torture. No Jiquang nodded back in acknowledgement and put the scalpel under another one of Jin Muwan's fingernails. However, before he could do anything, Xiao Musang stepped forward and said, Captain, aren't you going a bit too far? What, have you been affected by the brat's nonsense? He's just making up stuff so that he can get away from being tortured. Jiang Peisan waved him away dismissively, but Jin Muwan turned to face Xiao Musang, saying, Do you think so too? That I'm merely making up stuff so that I can get away from being tortured? Xiao Musang met Jin Muwan's gaze. It was obvious that Jin Muwan was in great pain. He tried to pretend that it didn't hurt, but his shaking, shivering body betrayed him. If Xiao Musang chose to turn a blind eye to his suffering now, the boy would probably die. In the end, though, he couldn't bring himself to do that. The reason was Jin Muwan's eyes. Although Jin Muwan's eyes were filled with pain, there was no fear in them. His resolve had not wavered in the least despite the torture. Xiao Musang had never seen another child Jin Muwan's age with such eyes. This kid? Xiao Musang turned to look at Zhang Peisan. Zhang Peisan repeated his orders for No Jiquang to proceed, but Xiao Musang interrupted him, saying, "Captain, why don't we try talking to the boy first? We can torture him again anytime if he doesn't say anything meaningful." "What? We can't be sure if he has any motives, but it wouldn't hurt to be careful, right?" said one Jixim. "I agree with them, Captain," added Yu Jiangchun. Zhang Peisan looked like he still wanted to continue, but the other men seemed to share Xiao Musang's opinion, so he had no choice but to give up for now. He crouched in front of Jin Muwan. "Brat, you better answer our questions properly, or I will cut you up into tiny pieces and scatter them on the plains for the wolf cubs to eat. I'm sure they'll love you for it." "You're threatening me again. You. Why do you think Heaven's Summit is keeping me alive? Why did they not kill me after my father's death, even though they literally had hundreds of opportunities to do so? What makes you think you're smarter than the ghost of Zhuge Liang of the Nine Skies, who made the decision to let me live? Even though my life isn't worth a fucking cent." Zhang Peisan made an ugly face when Jin Muwan brought up Xiao Munhua. Xiao Munhua, a member of the Nine Skies, the rulers of Heaven's Summit. It was a name that Zhang Peisan dared not mention. An existence far above his station. "You little rascal. What I meant was, that I'm a hostage." "A very valuable hostage," said Jin Muwan, smiling. The smiling face of a child covered in blood was more disturbing than pitiful. As Jin Muwan's eyes scanned across the crowd, each full-grown man who met his gaze couldn't stop themselves from shuddering as shivers ran down their spines. "What do you mean, you're a hostage? Think about it. What value would I have as a hostage?" Jin Muwan's voice possessed a strange charisma that made people listen closely to what he said. Even Xiao Musang had been drawn in without realizing and started to seriously consider the meaning of his words. Jin Muwan's value as a hostage. Just who would value this kid? After the disappearance of the Silent Night, the power balance in the world had shifted. Heaven's Summit stood at the very top, while the large sects and clans were still fighting for dominance. But, none of those factions would value Jin Muwan. If there was someone, they would have to be related to the Northern Army. Wait, the Northern Army? Suddenly, Zhang Peisan and his men remembered something. The warriors of the Northern Army. After the fall of the Northern Army, the Four Pillars set up base in the Central Plains. In exchange for their betrayal, all of the Murim factions had previously agreed that they would be given land. Most of the warriors of the former Northern Army had joined the Four Pillars' new factions. However, there were some who had not. Although these people had lost their roots, they were still not a force to be underestimated. Should they decide to rebel against Heaven's Summit, the entire Central Plains would descend into chaos. Even those who had joined the Four Pillars would get involved in the rebellion alongside their former comrades. On the surface, no one dared to challenge Heaven's Summit. That did not mean that the possibility didn't exist. The world's powers existed in a very delicate balance that could be shattered easily. What will happen if Jin Muwan dies? Will his death enrage the former Northern Army warriors who have become wanderers? If that happens, the warriors who follow the Four Pillars will rebel too. The Four Pillars would never allow that to happen. And neither would Heaven's Summit. Zhang Peisan bit his lip and groaned, Now think about what will happen to you guys. To us? Would Heaven's Summit let you guys off if they found out that you obtained the Northern Army's treasure or martial arts? No way. Even if they spared your lives, they'd still expel you. To make things worse, you tortured a hostage like me. If that gets out, the 4 pillars will move, and you guys are all as good as dead. What? The other men's faces turned pale as the realization finally hit them. In particular, No Ji Kwang, who had been the one directly torturing Jin Moo-won, was utterly horrified. You guys should understand the situation you're in now, right? We could just kill you secretly. How long do you think you could hide my death? If you think you can hide it forever, then go ahead and kill me. Jin Moo-won stuck his tongue out at Jang Pei-san, but Jang Pei-san hesitated to retaliate. Everything was just as Jin Moo-won had said. Even if he killed Jin Moo-won and ran back to the Central Plains, Heaven's Summit would definitely find him, because Heaven's Summit was the world itself. Now, untie me and treat my wounds. After that, I will start considering what you can do to compensate me. Ah! Jang Pei-san clenched his fist. Deep down, he knew that Jin Moo-won was right. However, his egotism was preventing him from accepting the truth. Seo Musang walked up to Jang Pei-san and whispered in his ear, "Even if he's lying, we have to let him go." Ah! We've already searched this place, right? And we didn't find any treasure or hidden martial arts manuals. The only thing here is the kid. We could easily kill the brat, but on the off chance that what he says is correct, then we'll all be executed along with our families. Jang Pei-san's face trembled with rage, but in the end, he had no choice but to agree with Seo Musang. "Untie him and send him back to his room," ordered Jang Pei-san. The men obeyed and freed Jin Moo-won from his restraints. Jin Moo-won forced himself to his feet and grabbed his shaking, throbbing finger. The fragments of his broken fingernail fell to the ground. Jin Moo-won stared daggers at Jang Pei-san and declared, "I will never forgive you. I'm letting you live for now, but if I ever find out that you were lying, I'll personally break all your bones." It seems that I didn't make myself clear enough. What do you mean? This is my home, and you are an unwanted guest. From now on, I want you to behave like a proper guest should. That means you're not allowed to search my room for no reason. You already know that the stuff in my room is mostly trash anyway, so stop wasting your time and efforts. If you can do this, I will pretend that the events of today never happened. Fine, but if you ever piss me off, I will kill you regardless of the consequences, and to hell with Heaven's Summit or the Northern Army. Remember that. Jin Moo-won walked toward the exit, grinning smugly. Jang Pei-san watched him go with a terrifying look in his eyes. Suddenly, Jin Moo-won stopped in front of Seo Musang. Their eyes met for a moment, but shortly after, Jin Moo-won said nothing and left. Puha! Jin Moo-won let out the breath he had been holding. The pain he had been trying so hard to ignore finally hit him. Although he had only lost one fingernail, the pain was beyond imagination. Jin Moo-won was now absolutely certain of one fact: the human body was much weaker than one would expect. Even what appeared to be a minor wound could hurt like hell. If he hadn't possessed inhuman resolve, it wouldn't have been possible for him to bargain with Jang Pei-san. My value as a hostage? Why would anyone believe that shit? No one actually thinks the remnants of the Northern Army are a threat. The 4 pillars probably didn't care if Jin Moo-won was alive or dead. On the other hand, that meant that he could use their name for his own benefit without problems. Jin Moo-won knew that his life was in his own hands. He would have to use every tool at his disposal if he wanted to survive inside his own home. Past and future, that was what he did, and what he would need to keep doing. Drenched in blood, Jin Moo-won walked back toward his mansion, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind his lonely back. After the events of that day, Jang Pei-san and the other men of the Third Company avoided Jin Moo-won like the plague. Nothing good would come out of associating with the boy, so they treated him like he didn't exist. This was good news for Jin Moo-won. At the very least, he wouldn't be tortured anymore. Still, he had to be wary of the extremely petty Jang Pei-san, who wouldn't forget the humiliation he'd received that day for a very long time. Sighed Jin Moo-won, looking down at the ruins of the Northern Army fortress. He was currently sitting on the roof of the Tower of Shadows, the tallest building in the fortress. Although the 12-story building was mostly intact, it wouldn't be weird if it collapsed any time, and most people avoided ascending the building. However, after what happened last time with the kidnapping incident, Jin Moo-won dared not go outside anymore. He instead started climbing to the top of the Tower of Shadows. Jin Moo-won lay down, awake, on the roof tiles all night long. Seo Mu-sang watched him from afar, even though he knew that doing so was meaningless. He was only observing Jin Moo-won now out of pure curiosity. For some reason, he just couldn't take his eyes off the boy. "You're really brave despite not knowing any martial arts." Jin Moo-won's sheer courage and audacity shocked Seo Mu-sang. He knew that Jin Moo-won had lied, his claims and reasoning were riddled with flaws. Anyone who thought carefully about what he had said would have realized that. The four pillars all rank among the strongest martial artists in the world. For people like them to lose control of their followers, is that even possible? Jang Pei-san had been too intimidated by the mention of the Northern Army and Heaven Summit, and had not noticed this fact. That was not the case for Seo Mu-sang. He had immediately seen through Jin Moo-won's lies, he just didn't feel like informing Jang Pei-san. True, he had been tempted by the mention of a treasure and martial arts manuals, but he hadn't wanted to torture a child to obtain these things. Furthermore, he had already personally searched the fortress and confirmed that there was indeed nothing of value in this place. He was upset that he had to waste away for 3 years, but he didn't want to take it out on Jin Moo-won. Truth be told, he actually admired Jin Moo-won. A boy who could remain calm and manipulate people while being tortured despite not knowing martial arts, was nothing if not admirable. It's a pity. If only he had learnt the martial arts of the Northern Army, he would have definitely become a great man and a world leader. Jin Moo-won's daring was not something that could be taught. He was born a tiger cub, but unfortunately for this tiger cub, his father passed away before he could grow up. Even baby tigers needed their parents' protection to grow up safely. Seo Mu-sang could only lament that Jin Moo-won's path to greatness had been blocked by his misfortune. He watched Jin Moo-won for a little while longer, then left. Jin Moo-won had been a major disappointment, but it had nothing to do with him, so there was nothing for him to regret. In the eyes of Heaven Summit, the boy had already reached his limits. Seo Mu-sang suddenly lost interest in Jin Moo-won. The boy wasn't a threat. Without a sound, he vanished into the darkness. When Seo Mu-sang had gone, Jin Moo-won did not get up. He didn't know what he should do next. He simply lay down and fell asleep, waking up only at the break of dawn. When he saw the reddish rays of the rising sun, he stood up. "Fuck!" he screamed as he accidentally grazed his nailless finger against the roof. It had already been 3 days since the kidnapping and a scab had formed on the wound, but the pain was still tormenting him constantly. This is a small price to pay for getting rid of their suspicions, he told himself. When he treated what had happened as a necessary ritual that would guarantee his survival for the next 3 years, he felt much better. Jin Moo-won looked toward the east. The light from the rising sun shone upon the ruins of the Northern Army fortress, bathing the fortress, which had been shrouded in darkness, in golden light. As the darkness was swept away, shadows appeared. Rays of light penetrated through cracks in the walls and buildings, creating mysterious patterns from the contrast between light and shadow. Jin Moo-won's eyes lit up. The shadows created by sunlight shining upon the carvings on the walls, turned the seemingly meaningless designs into something resembling words. He focused his attention on the walls. As the sun rose, the angles of light and shadow changed, until finally the text could be read. In the beginning, there was only pure energy, and then it split into light and shadow. Light and shadow can mix in different ways, but in the end, all of creation is unified by their harmony. The world is filled with the lights of many souls, but I embrace the shadows. Becoming the darkness of the night sky that is lit up by a sea of stars. Jin Muwan stared unblinking at the phenomenon created by the interaction of light and shadow. The greatest secret of the Northern Army revealed itself to him. As the sun moved across the sky and the shadows shifted, words would appear and disappear. These words came together to form one martial arts manual after another. This mysterious sight could only be observed from the roof of the Tower of Shadows. These words were written in the language of the Moon River Kingdom, a kingdom that was destroyed a long time ago in a war. Jin Quanho hadn't taught his son martial arts, but he had taught him how to read the language of the Moon River Kingdom. Thus, Jin Muwan was now the only living person who could read this language. In the eyes of others, these words were no more than random glyphs. Thousands of people had been to the Northern Army fortress, but Jin Muwan was now the only person left who knew of this secret. Not even the 4 pillars were told about it. People simply called it the Wall of 10,000 Shadows. They had no idea that the legacy of every lord of the Northern Army was carved on that very wall. It wasn't always martial arts. Sometimes when one of the previous lords had an idea, they would organize their thoughts on the fortress wall. After many years, the wall eventually became the current Wall of 10,000 Shadows. All of the lords starting from the first generation Buk Jinhu, to the 4th generation Jin Quanho, had left their writings behind on the wall. Because the wall was merely a medium for them to write down their thoughts, the writings ended up being spread out all over the place. Some of the writings had more depth, while others had more breadth. Some discussed the theory of martial arts, while others discussed their understanding of foot techniques. 2 types of writings were of particular interest to Jin Muwan. The first was sword techniques, and the second was the qi cultivation idea left behind by Buk Jinhu. At a glance, one could see that after the lines of the qi cultivation idea that was written like a poem, Buk Jinhu and every one of his successors had left their own explanations and interpretations of the text, all coming together to form the complete art of 10,000 Shadows. As the notes about the art accumulated over the years, the art of 10,000 Shadows had taken up more and more space on the walls, extending to even the deepest parts of the fortress. The 10,000 words felt more like a thought process rather than a simple conclusion. Because of its sheer length, the art of 10,000 Shadows could also be called the 10,000-word martial art. Although the art of 10,000 Shadows had been refined over several generations, it was still merely a theory. No one had ever mastered it before. Buk Jinhu, the first lord of the Northern Army and the one who came up with the initial idea, was from Nanjing. He wasn't a disciple of any famous martial arts schools, so his foundations weren't particularly solid. He belonged to the type of martial artist who had gotten strong through actual combat experience. As he hadn't been indoctrinated about common sense in martial arts since childhood, the techniques and ideas that he developed tended to be very unconventional. In addition, he was a genius with an imagination far surpassing any other. The art of 10,000 Shadows was the culmination of his wild imagination. Most of Buk Jinhu's life had been spent on the battlefield fighting against the Silent Knight, and he had very little free time to ponder the details of Shadow Qi. Therefore, that was all the information about Shadow Qi that he had left behind when he died. A few dozen years after Buk Jinhu's death, the second lord of the Northern Army, Nam Un San, decided to continue working on Buk Jinhu's idea. At that time, the Northern Army was doing very badly in the war against the Silent Knight. The martial arts of the Silent Knight were self-destructive to the practitioner, but they possessed incredible offensive power far beyond the martial arts of the Central Plains. Thus, Nam Un San concluded that new martial arts needed to be developed to fight against the Silent Knight and began to refine Buk Jinhu's Shadow Qi idea. However, the one who truly turned the shadow qi from an idea into a real cultivation technique was the third lord, Yu Kuangyun. Yu Kuangyun had had his qi center, 5, destroyed in a fierce battle with the black-winged divine spear, one of the 4 great demon generals. Instead of resigning himself to an inevitable death, Yu Kuangyun chose to study the shadow qi and turn it into reality. He created an imaginary qi center to replace his destroyed one and filled it with a completely different type of energy from qi. This was the energy that Book Jinhu had named shadow qi. Like an actual shadow, shadow qi was immaterial and only those who practiced it could feel its energy. Its presence pulled Yu Kuangyun back from the brink of death and gave him a new reason to live. Yu Kuangyun then immersed himself in perfecting the shadow qi for the rest of his life. Yu Kuangyun felt that if he managed to master shadow qi, he would be able to revamp the entire qi cultivation system. However, before he could complete his work, he succumbed to his injuries and passed away. He had realized the importance of shadow qi when it was already too late, and the little time he had left was far from enough to perfect it. Before his death, the technique was passed down to his successor, the fourth lord and Jin Muwan's father, Jin Quanho. Jin Quanho had inherited his predecessor's will to perfect the technique, but he died young and never managed to study shadow qi or work on improving the art of 10,000 shadows. Although Jin Muwan knew that art of 10,000 shadows was incomplete, he still chose to learn it. It was something he would have never even considered if not for his situation. The 4 pillars had taken away every other martial arts manual, and Heaven's Summit monitored his every move. He had no choice but to learn a martial art that was completely undetectable by others, even if the search for a path to perfecting the art made him feel completely lost, like he was fumbling around on a small raft in the open seas at night with no guiding light and no idea where the destination was. The end of his road could be a sea of despair, but it could also be a new world shining with hope. He didn't know. He could only move forward, one step at a time, one day at a time. Suddenly, Jin Muwan smiled. At least I have something to hope for. I've still got something I can do. It was worth the gamble. Jin Muwan was satisfied by the mere thought that whether he succeeded or not, at least he wouldn't have wasted his time not even trying. He closed his eyes and continued contemplating the art of 10,000 shadows. Just like that, his morning quickly came to an end. Jin Muwan strolled around the northern army fortress with his eyes closed. Everyone who saw him thought that he was just wandering about aimlessly. In truth, he was mulling over the art of 10,000 shadows. This was a very abstract phrase, and the explanatory text wasn't particularly helpful either. Jin Muwan couldn't be sure if it was a method of circulating qi or a lesson in ethics. I need to strike a balance between both interpretations because the art of 10,000 shadows isn't simply a qi cultivation technique, it's also a philosophical text. Suddenly, Jin Muwan opened his eyes. His precognition told him that someone he welcomed very much would be arriving at the fortress in the near future. Not far away, he saw Jiang Peisan and his men hanging out. They didn't bother him anymore and treated him like he didn't exist, because doing so was a waste of everyone's time. Once the third company had understood that they would gain nothing from messing around with him, the tension between them disappeared. The men had become so relaxed from the lack of societal pressures that they would discuss all sorts of obscene things in public in order to while away the time. All they thought about was how to get past each day without feeling bored. As for the orders from their higher-ups to keep a lookout for the silent night, that was all but forgotten. It was a repeat of what their predecessors did. And just like them, these guys would spend their days doing nothing until it was time to return to the Central Plains. Jin Muwan took a step forward. His injured finger was still throbbing with pain, but he did not show it on his face. Whether he liked it or not, he'd have to spend 3 years with these mercenaries. To ensure that they would ignore him, he'd have to keep a low profile at all times and always hide his true emotions. He walked past Jiang Peisan and headed for the backyard. In the past, this had been a beautiful garden with exotic plants, man-made landscapes and a big pond. Now that no one took care of it, though, it had become overrun with weeds. Jin Moo-won would sometimes come here in order to rest and avoid people, but today, someone had gotten here before him. Swoosh! There was a man brandishing his sword recklessly. He crushed the grass beneath his feet and chopped off the bushes at waist level, sending plant debris flying through the air. Pant, pant, gasped said man, who turned out to be Seo Musang. He must have been training for quite some time, as his entire body was drenched in sweat. Jin Moo-won paused and observed Seo Musang quietly. Seo Musang had an expression filled with self-loathing and was venting out his frustrations on the plants like a crazy guy. The Blue Cloud Sword Style. That was the name of one of the martial arts that was taught to every grunt in Heaven Summit. It was a martial art that could be learned within a very short time due to its simple moves and effective chi cultivation method. However, everyone knew that there was a limit to how strong one could get by practicing it. If one wanted to surpass that limit, they'd have to obtain better martial arts, but Heaven Summit would never easily hand over such treasures to a mere affiliate mercenary like Seo Musang. The only way for him to obtain high-level martial arts was to be promoted to a high position within Heaven Summit, or make a great accomplishment and be rewarded. Unfortunately, Vice Captain Seo Musang wasn't in a position where he could do either. He looked like he was randomly waving a sword around, but his movements were sharp and concise, and he followed the trail of his sword with his eyes. He might not have been particularly talented, but he definitely had a solid foundation. After finishing his sword dance, Seo Musang threw his sword on the ground. Clang! Ah! God damn it, yelled Seo Musang resentfully, his voice hoarse. Suddenly, he noticed Jin Moo-won looking at him and raised his head. Their eyes met. You got a problem with me coming here? No, it was empty anyway. Then get lost. Seo Musang's attitude toward Jin Moo-won was plain rude. That was because every time he saw the boy, he would be reminded of his regrets and lingering ambitions. Jin Moo-won lowered his head slightly in acknowledgement, then left. Seo Musang resumed swinging his sword around wildly. The cut leaves and grass spun and danced in the air. A gentle breeze stirred up ripples in the pond water, causing Seo Musang's reflection to blur as if he were shivering. 1 year later. Jin Moo-won looked up. It was a fine day, with not a cloud in the sky, and he could even see the plains far into the distance. Normally, this sight would make him smile, but not today. Winter was coming. Soon, the temperature would start decreasing at a frightening rate, and the winds would freeze one right to the bone. The northern plains would be quickly transformed into a world of white. Ah, fuck. It's freezing. Hurry up and move the things inside. If anything's missing, we'll need to inform the suppliers right away. Jang Pei-san's loud complaint pierced Jin Moo-won's eardrums. He turned around and saw Jang Pei-san nagging at 3 people pushing a filled supply wagon. An evil grin spread over his face. The winter last year had been really cold. Even Jin Moo-won, a local, couldn't stand the harsh winters of the north. Then, just how bad had it been for these people experiencing it for the first time? They learnt what frostbite was, and the feeling of breathing in air that was like knives slicing through their lungs. Also, because they underestimated the amount of food they would need to eat to resist the cold, they had been left with no choice but to go out and get supplies in the middle of a blizzard. Jin Moo-won could still remember the looks on their faces. Evidently, they had learned their lesson. About a month ago, Jang Pei-san had written to Heaven Summit requesting several times more food and necessities than the previous year. Not only that, he had also bought a ton of fur from the hunters in the nearest village, and clumsily sewed himself several coats in preparation for the coming winter. It was the second winter that Jin Moo-won and Jang Pei-san were going to have to spend together. Their relationship hadn't changed, though. For the whole of the last year, both of them had pretended that the other didn't exist, just like ostriches burying their heads in the sand. In just 1 year, Jin Muwan had grown a lot taller and even his scrawny body was starting to show a little muscle. However, the most noticeable things about him were his stubbornly pursed lips and the profound look in his eyes that made the 16-year-old look like a mature adult. Xiao Musang looked at Jin Muwan warily. Although his hatred for the boy seemed to have diminished a little bit, there was still some killing intent left in his eyes. Jin Muwan could feel Xiao Musang's gaze, but he did not pay it any mind. He knew that Xiao Musang's hostility toward him had decreased significantly over the past year. While Zhang Peisan and the other mercenaries were wasting away, Xiao Musang diligently worked on improving his swordsmanship. Every day, as he swung his sword and practiced his footwork, the grass around his feet was uprooted until the ground became barren and hard. Xiao Musang had completely mastered the blue cloud sword style by now. However, he had been getting more and more irritable lately as there was no more room left for him to improve. "Young master." A familiar voice called out to Jin Muwan. Jin Muwan smiled. A man in his 30s stood in front of him, dragging a large horse-drawn cart behind him. He had tanned skin and looked a lot older than he actually was. "Uncle Huang." "Young master, how are you?" Huang Qiol smiled. He had brought an entire cart filled with winter supplies for Jin Muwan. "I'm fine, thank you for your concern." "How have you been, Uncle Huang?" greeted Jin Muwan. "I'm nice and healthy, as you can see. I'm freezing though, so can we go inside now?" Huang Qiol was tempted to push Jin Muwan all the way back into his room. Jin Muwan grinned as he led Huang Qiol indoors. He looked at Huang Qiol's cart. It was filled to the brim with food and other necessities. "Uncle Huang worked hard to save up and buy this stuff for me." In the face of Huang Qiol's loyalty and sincerity, Jin Muwan sniffed and felt the tip of his nose getting colder and colder as his snot froze. "Uncle Huang, you don't have to do this for me. But I want to do it. The price of these goods means nothing to me compared to the precious young master," cried Huang Qiol, tears dripping down his face. Jin Muwan beamed and patted him on the shoulder, saying, "Don't cry, Uncle Huang. I'm really thankful for your concern, that's all." Huang Qiol did not reply and only smiled bitterly. Jin Muwan should never have ended up this way. If not for the Northern Army's efforts, the Central Plains would have been nowhere near as prosperous as they were now. 100 years ago when the Silent Night first invaded, the Central Plains had been on the brink of destruction. Even now, the wounds of war had not completely healed. But time was fleeting, and so was human nature. As soon as the Central Plains had recovered a little, they forgot about the scars and despair from that time and began to vie among themselves for power again. They forgot about the Northern Army's accomplishments and destroyed it for selfish reasons. Now, they had even forgotten about Jin Muwan. "Any news about the outside world?" asked Jin Muwan as they entered his room. Huang Qiol suppressed his feelings of bitterness and began to tell Jin Muwan about recent events. He was the young man's only link to the rest of the world, and the only source of information about stuff happening in the Central Plains. From this information, Jin Muwan could deduce the rough directions that the world was taking, so he always listened very carefully to the stories that Huang Qiol told. Huang Qiol talked all night long, and Jin Muwan's laughter could be heard from time to time through the gaps around the door. When morning arrived, Huang Qiol prepared a nice breakfast for Jin Muwan. Jin Muwan wanted to share the food, but Huang Qiol refused. In the end, he finished all the food by himself, causing Huang Qiol to grin with satisfaction. "Young master, I have transferred everything to the storeroom. Be sure to eat well. Don't worry. Ever since then, I've made sure to eat 3 meals a day." Despite Jin Muwan's answer, Huang Qiol did not feel relieved. Jin Muwan understood how Huang Qiol felt. If their positions had been reversed, he would probably have felt the same way. Just then, Jin Muwan's gaze shifted toward Huang Qiu's cart. Most of the goods had been removed, but there was still some stuff left. "What's that?" asked Jin Muwan, pointing to a rock about the size of a toddler. The obsidian rock with a dull black gleam looked extremely heavy. "I got it on my travels. I heard that it was a meteorite that had fallen from the heavens, and that a tribe was worshipping it as a holy rock." "How did something like that end up in Uncle's hands?" "The tribe was massacred, so the rock became the property of no one." "They were massacred?" "It seems like they got into a conflict with the Tyrant Fist sect." Shocked speechless, Jin Muwan looked up at the sky. The dawn had arrived and the sky was getting brighter, but that did not make him feel any better. "The Tyrant Fist sect is in Yunnan, right?" "Yes. It's probably because there aren't many martial arts factions over there." Jin Muwan closed his eyes. The 4 traders of the Northern Army had all chosen to set up their own factions in the Central Plains. The Phantom Blade Yun Chionhua had set up base in the west and created the Greatsword Fortress, also known as the Fortress in the Western Paradise. The Wind Emperor Kyung Musang created the Tempest Mountain Villa. Although his martial arts were balanced between footwork and close combat, because of his followers, his faction ended up mostly combat-focused. The strongest among the 4 pillars, the Ironblood Emperor Jae Hyukshim created the Ironblood City in the northern region of the Central Plains. He was a master of defensive martial arts, but his subversive personality frightened everyone, including his own followers. Finally, the Fist Demon Jo Cheonwoo created the Tyrant Fist sect. He was cruel, ruthless and relentless to the point where he would charge forward without looking back once he had a target, like an unstoppable raging bear. The Tyrant Fist sect was situated in Yunnan to avoid territorial conflicts with other large factions, but in the process of its expansion, it annihilated and absorbed countless small sects and tribes. "Don't worry too much about what happened, young master. I'll take this away so you don't have to look at it." "No, don't. For some reason, it has captured my heart." Jin Muwan reached out with his fingertips and touched the rock. The icy chill that he felt weighed heavily on his heart. The sky was overcast and snow began to fall over the Northern Army fortress. At first, it was just a few snowflakes, but it soon developed into a full-blown blizzard where one couldn't see even an inch ahead of them. After 3 days of snowfall, everything had turned white and the accompanying cold froze the entire world solid. Winter had arrived. Jang Peisan and the other men of the Third Company completely cancelled all their outdoor activities. However, Jin Muwan continued going on his daily walks despite the wind chill and would often pull all-nighters on the roof of the Tower of Shadows. Only after the sun had risen would he return to his room. He'd then sleep for a bit and read the books that Huang Qiu had given him. Jin Muwan's continued adherence to his daily routine made Xiao Musang frown. No matter how stubborn one would need incredible tenacity to be able to endure living like that every single day for years. Time seemed to crawl to a standstill in this desolate place, and visitors were rare. The longer one spent here, the quicker the feelings of isolation and depression would erode away at the mind, sending one spiraling into the depths of madness. Not even the mercenaries were exempted from these emotions. Not too long ago, a few men in the Third Company had already shown signs of going insane. If Jang Peisan hadn't realized and interfered in time, they would have completely lost their minds. Unlike Jin Muwan, at least these guys had something to look forward to. They only had to endure another 2 years of this isolation, and then they'd be able to go back to their homes. This was the point that most concerned Xiao Musang. How on earth does Jin Muwan manage to remain so calm and rational knowing that he's probably going to spend the rest of his days living aimlessly like this? Unbeknownst to Xiao Musang, Jin Muwan did have something to live for. The art of 10,000 shadows. Without this ray of hope, he would likely have ended up going crazy just as Xiao Musang had expected. Jin Muwan's days began with the art of 10,000 shadows, and ended with the art of 10,000 shadows. As soon as the sun began to rise over the horizon, he would climb to the roof of the Tower of Shadows and read the manuals. Even when he was walking about aimlessly later in the day, he'd still be mulling over the art in his head. Every waking moment, including his every breath, movement, and even meals, were spent contemplating the art of 10,000 shadows. Recently though, Jin Muwon had been feeling depressed. He had hit a roadblock in his understanding of the art and had stopped improving. This phrase appeared in the middle of the art of 10,000 shadows. The meanings of many of the poetic phrases were vague, but this phrase in particular resonated strongly with Jin Muwon. I have no idea what it means to have a strong heart. Jin Muwon knew that it was okay to skip this part for now and move on, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The phrase kept coming back to haunt him as if something in his heart was missing. He tried to read the art in its entirety multiple times, but it was as if he were trapped in a blinding fog. A strong heart should suffice. Is it enough to just have a strong and healthy heart? I just don't get it. I don't get it at all. Jin Muwon gave up thinking and went to the Grand Library. Perhaps he would be able to find a solution to his problems in the books there. Crunch, crunch. The sound of his footsteps in the snow echoed around the empty fortress. The cold reached his toes and jolted him awake. He raised his head and saw that the snow had started falling again after a brief respite. Jin Muwon had a feeling that this year's winter was going to feel much longer than the ones before. Most importantly, it wouldn't be one that went past meaninglessly. Along one wall of the library, there was a large stack of new books. These books had been gifts from Huang Chiol, who would often buy second-hand books for Jin Muwon whenever he passed by a bookstore during his regular deliveries. Suddenly, Jin Muwon furrowed his brows. A window had been shattered inwards, and there was snow on the floor. Someone else had entered the Grand Library. That person had left footprints in the snow on the floor, so he followed the footprints to a corner of the library. Whoosh! Just as he was about to go around the corner, he felt the cold touch of metal against his neck. Jin Muwon was shocked speechless. Someone had crept up behind him and placed a glowing white dagger against his neck. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the curvy and petite figure of the assassin. A girl? The girl looked really young, probably no more than 14 years of age. She left a strong impression on him with her unusually pale skin, eyes shining like black crystals, lips as red as blood, and black hair with a hint of blue. The girl whispered from behind him, "Who are you? I should be asking you that question." She tightened her grip on the dagger, saying, "Answer me. I am the owner of this place." Owner? So that would make you the heir to the Northern Army? The Northern Army doesn't exist anymore, but yes, I am the heir. Now it's your turn. The dagger dug into his skin and made him wonder if he was going to be killed in the very next moment, but there was no fear in Jin Muwon's steady voice. Crash. The girl's voice trailed off as she suddenly collapsed, dropping the dagger on the ground. Jin Muwon turned around. The girl's shoulder and even the floor was drenched in blood. Jin Muwon hurriedly put his ear on the girl's chest. Her heartbeat was very irregular, and it sounded as if it could stop any time. He had no idea who she was or what she was doing here, but he couldn't let her die right in front of him. He picked up the girl in his arms and carried her to his room. After placing her down on his bed, he carefully removed her long cloak, revealing her bloodied clothes. Then, he slowly peeled away the cloth around her shoulder wound. "Ah!" exclaimed Jin Muwon, frowning, as he examined the girl's wound. There was a hole the size of a coin, and the skin around the hole had turned black. "You've been poisoned?" From the size of the wound, Jin Muwon could tell that it had probably been made by an arrow or a small dagger. He opened the drawer of a dresser next to his bed and took out a small bottle. "I hope this works." Besides martial arts, the Northern Army had heavily invested in the development of new medicines. It was only natural given that they had been fighting a war with the Silent Night for over 100 years. One of the new medicines developed by them was the heart-protecting detoxification pill, which was very effective at removing poisons from the body. Unfortunately, both the recipe for this pill and the pills themselves had been lost during the fall of the Northern Army. The one that Jin Mu-won possessed was the only one left in existence. Jin Mu-won didn't want to risk failure, so he decided to use this pill without hesitation. He opened the bottle and a black mist appeared, followed by a mild but pleasant scent. He had eaten all the other pills except for this one because it was the only one that had no effect on increasing his strength. Jin Mu-won pressed gently on the girl's throat and her lips parted slightly. He then put the pill in her mouth where it immediately dissolved and was swallowed. He searched through the drawer again. This time, he took out a wooden box filled with acupuncture needles. He inserted one near the girl's wound and the blood soon stopped flowing out. "Ha," sighed Jin Mu-won in relief. He had already done everything he could. Now that he had some free time, he took a closer look at the girl's face. She appeared to be only a year or two younger than him, and she was very pretty. She had long eyelashes, a high nose bridge, and rosy red lips. It was as if she had walked out of a painting. The contrast between her pale skin and dark, blue-black hair only served to accentuate her beauty. She was already a very alluring flower bud now, but in a few years, she would become a fully blooming flower. Why did I pick up this guest even though I don't have a room for her to stay in? Jin Mu-won sat on his chair, sighing. Jin Mu-won was awoken by the strange feeling of something on his neck. He opened his eyes and saw a girl holding a dagger to his throat. He couldn't help but smile resignedly. This again? The first time they met, she had held a dagger to his throat too. It seemed that she was still wary of him even though he had been kind enough to save her. Perhaps she was used to living a dangerous lifestyle. "You're awake now. Did you save me? You saw that? Why did you do it? I couldn't let you die right in front of me. It would also be unpleasant if someone died in my house." The girl bit her lip at Jin Mu-won's answer. "How long was I out for?" 3 days. You wouldn't wake up, so I was already prepared to bury your corpse. You mean, I've been unconscious for 3 days? Jin Mu-won nodded. A light flashed in the girl's eyes. Jin Mu-won did not know the girl's circumstances, but at the rate her condition had been deteriorating, he might have really needed to bury her corpse. Even after swallowing the heart-protecting detoxification pill, her health didn't improve and her fever remained high. In an attempt to reduce her fever, Jin Mu-won had constantly changed the cool, wet cloth on her forehead without rest for 3 whole days. The fact that she managed to wake up despite all that is a miracle, he thought. The girl mused over Jin Mu-won's words for a while, then put away the dagger. "I'll be staying here for some time until my wound heals completely." Her tone sounded more like she was giving orders and not at all like she was making a request, but Jin Mu-won felt that a haughty attitude suited her very much. "What's your name? Why do you need to know it? I feed you and let you sleep in my room. Shouldn't you at least tell me your name?" The girl bit her lip and remained silent for a while, before saying, "Eun Ha-seol. That's such a nice-sounding name. Well, my room is the best room in this place, so you should keep staying here. Also, you need to rest now." Jin Mu-won got up from the chair and began to pack his stuff. Although he had lived here for a few years, he didn't have much luggage. Eun Ha-seol watched as he moved his things out of the room, a confused look on her face. She had basically just threatened him. She couldn't understand why Jin Mu-won was so eager to do whatever she'd asked of him. This guy isn't normal. Suddenly, she felt a sharp twinge in her shoulder and closed her eyes, trembling uncontrollably as her wound throbbed painfully. After giving his room to Eun Ha-seol, Jin Mu-won moved into the Tower of Shadows. He laughed out loud. She was interesting, so he decided to give his room to a girl he had just met, despite knowing that taking in a mysterious girl with an unknown background was an extremely risky thing to do. He knew that she probably had a very dangerous enemy who could give her a terrible wound like that. He knew that doing this would make the mercenaries suspicious of him. He knew that he was still too weak to resist them. He was also painfully aware that if he showed the slightest weakness, or let the mercenaries see through the smallest crack, that he would be completely devoured by the beasts. Even so, Jin Muwan chose to let Un Ha-seol stay with him. Am I really that lonely? Maybe I've gotten tired of this lifestyle. Maybe I'm just childishly craving human interaction. I don't know. Jin Muwan was only 16. He wasn't an adult yet. Un Ha-seol went outdoors and took a deep breath. As the cold air entered her lungs, she finally felt alive again. She had spent the last 3 days diligently tending to her wound inside Jin Muwan's room. If not for that, she would still be lying down in bed. Still, she had to be careful. Jin Muwan had managed to bring her back from the brink of death using the heart-protecting detoxification pill, but a lot of poison remained in her body. This poison was just too strong, leaving her with no choice but to slowly expel it from her body over a very long period of time. I wonder how long this is going to take. First, I must regain my strength. Only then can I use my chi to slowly expel the poison. She looked around the Northern Army fortress. All she saw were empty snow-covered pavilions, towers, and castles. It was an eerie sight. So this is the Northern Army fortress. It seems that you can move around now. Un Ha-seol spun around to face the owner of the voice. She saw Jin Muwan, who was holding up a torch. Noticing Un Ha-seol's surprise, Jin Muwan smiled and said, "As you can see, there's nothing here. This place was once prosperous, but now it's just a miserable wreck. I wouldn't live here if I had a choice. Oh, and if possible, use the resources wisely. I probably have barely enough food for the two of us to survive the winter." Un Ha-seol's eyes lit up. Please don't ask me about my true identity. She was curious why the young man had accepted her despite not knowing anything about her. Come with me. I'll show you around. You'll be staying here for quite some time, right? Jin Muwan finished saying what he wanted to say, and then immediately turned around and walked away. Un Ha-seol chased after him. 2 different sets of footprints appeared on the white snow of the fortress and were slowly covered up by the falling snow in the order they had formed. Above their heads, a bird flew past. A messenger hawk? Jang Pei-san appeared puzzled to see the large bird flying above the Northern Army fortress. He reached out and the messenger hawk landed gently on his arm. It must be quite an important message. Heaven Summit often used highly trained messenger hawks to dispatch important orders to their branches in the Central Plains. However, this was the very first message that Jang Pei-san had received after arriving at the Northern Army fortress last year. This was a place that Heaven Summit didn't give a shit about, after all. A small bamboo tube was attached to the hawk's leg using a red cloth. The red cloth meant that there would be a paid job for Jang Pei-san. He hurriedly opened the tube and took out the rolled-up letter inside. Honored guests will be arriving in spring, so be prepared to welcome them? What the fuck? The corners of Jang Pei-san's lips twitched as he spouted off a string of profanities. Truth be told, he had hoped that it would be good news. He had literally been praying that he would be summoned back to the Central Plains. Unfortunately for him, the contents of the letter were about something else entirely. What's so fucking interesting about this place? Is this supposed to be some kind of a tourist resort? Why the heck are these honored guests coming all the way here just to freeze to death? Empty Jang Pei-san finally erupted after being dormant for so long. I didn't want to be exiled, it's not fair. On top of all that, now they're telling me to turn this shithole into a hotel for distinguished guests. By the start of spring? Thought Jang Pei-san, heart thumping with indignation. Still, orders were orders. He didn't dare disobey orders from the higher-ups, regardless of whether they wanted him to face danger or dirty his hands. In the eyes of the mighty Heaven Summit, he was a mere insect who could be crushed at any time. God damn it. We'll have to fix up one of the empty castles. From the fact that Heaven Summit had sent him the order by Messenger Hawk, he knew that these honored guests were no ordinary guys. They were definitely people of high standing or came from privileged families. He would have to prepare a proper place for them to stay. Oi, Vice Captain. Jiang Peisan summoned Co Musang and informed him that there would be esteemed guests arriving in spring. Upon hearing the news, Co Musang initially reacted in the exact same way as Jiang Peisan. It would be one thing for these guests to visit the fortress once, but it seems that they actually want to live here for a year or more? This might seem annoying, but it might actually be a good thing. We should take advantage of this opportunity, said Jiang Peisan. Opportunity? What opportunity? These guys are VIPs. If they take a liking to you, you might be able to leave this place sooner than you think. Co Musang's eyes lit up at Jiang Peisan's suggestion. He had gotten sick and tired of these boring, uneventful days. A month here felt like a year in the Central Plains. Most importantly, he had a reason to return to the Central Plains as soon as he could. I think it's about time we renovate the Lofty Sky Manor. I agree. The Lofty Sky Manor is the nicest looking building in this ruin. I will inform young Master Jean. What for? He is technically the owner of this fortress. We should make sure that he at least makes a show of hospitality. I'll leave that up to you, then. Yes, sir. A real man should turn a crisis into an opportunity, huh? I'm such a genius. Alright, this is my chance. I'm gonna end this boring mission and return to the Central Plains. Jiang Peisan roared with laughter. Looking at things from a different perspective had made him feel a lot better about the situation. Co Musang was about to ask Jiang Peisan for permission to take his leave when he realized that the man had become completely absorbed in a world of his own imagination. Thus, he simply left and headed to where Jin Muwan was. Jin Muwan always followed a regular schedule. After more than a year together, Co Musang knew exactly where he would be at this time of day. Co Musang went to the Wall of 10,000 Shadows. He wasn't surprised to find Jin Muwan there. But he was very surprised to see a girl standing next to him, emanating an aura that screamed, "I am an extremely suspicious person." Co Musang was dumbfounded. He approached Jin Muwan and called out, "Young Master Jin." "Vice Captain." Co Musang quietly stared at Un Hasiol and waited for an explanation. She is Huang Qiol's niece. Both of her parents passed away when she was young, so Uncle Huang raised her. He brought her with him last time, and she decided to stay here until the next time he comes back, said Jin Muwan, who had made up a false identity for Un Hasiol in advance. Co Musang examined the girl's appearance closely as Jin Muwan was talking. As he locked gazes with the girl's obsidian-like eyes, he felt faint for a moment, like he had been struck by lightning. Her eyes. Un Hasiol's eyes were blindingly pure and crystal clear. Any man who saw those eyes would be bewitched by their perfection. Co Musang couldn't believe that eyes like that could belong to a real, living person. "Are you really Huang Qiol's niece? I will be staying here for a while, so please take good care of me." Co Musang sighed. He was familiar with Jin Muwan's one and only loyal servant, Huang Qiol. Since the girl was Huang Qiol's niece, there was nothing more he could say. "Why did you come looking for me? Did you have something to say to me?" asked Jin Muwan. "Ah, that's right. Several honored guests from Heaven Summit will be coming here in the spring. Is it okay if we renovate the Lofty Sky Manor for them? Go ahead. No one's using it now, anyway." Jin Muwan gave his permission without hesitation. The lofty Sky Manor was the building situated right opposite his mansion. It had been abandoned for a long time, and he himself hardly went there. Therefore, he didn't really care if someone used it for their own purposes. The guests were the bigger problem. Seo Musang had referred to them as honored guests, which meant that they were people of rather high status. The thought of having to associate with such tiresome people gave Jin Muwan a headache. It was not like he had a choice, though. The vice-captain had acted like he was making a request, but he was actually just informing Jin Muwan about something that had already been decided. Jin Muwan left, with Un Ha-seol following behind him. Seo Musang silently looked at Un Ha-seol's rear profile as she walked away. Jin Muwan cut down a redwood tree. Using a whittling knife, he slowly carved the wood into the shape he desired. When he was finished, a perfect wooden sword appeared in his hands. He waved it around to test its balance and see if there were any parts he didn't like. Un Ha-seol, who was sitting beside him, looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Are you having fun?" "No, not at all." "Why did you cut down the tree yourself?" "Because no one will do it for me." "Then why did you make a wooden sword?" "I recently started to learn the sword." Un Ha-seol's eyes suddenly lit up. "You've never learned martial arts before? Is that weird? You're the heir to the Northern Army. Isn't it weird for the heir to not know any martial arts? As you can see, there is no Northern Army anymore. Also, I was too busy trying to survive each day. Where would I find the time to learn martial arts?" Un Ha-seol ignored Jin Muwan's replies and looked around, confused. They were inside the Grand Library. The bookshelves had been filled with the books that Huang Cheol had brought, but everything still looked extremely shabby. This pathetic sight didn't live up to the name of the Northern Army at all. The only martial arts left on the shelves were third-rate ones like the 6 Directions Fist, the 3 Foundations of Swordsmanship, and Cloud Steps. Un Ha-seol couldn't understand why Jin Muwan would bother learning such inferior martial arts. Jin Muwan didn't care what she thought about it, though. He examined his sword, smiling all the while, before finally standing up in satisfaction. The ground beneath his feet was covered in wood shavings. He swung the sword. Whoosh! It was his first time making a wooden sword, but the weight and balance felt good in his hands. He continued swinging the sword with a serious expression. Un Ha-seol looked at him like he was out of his mind. The 3 Foundations of Swordsmanship? Jin Muwan was practicing the 3 Foundations of Swordsmanship that even third-rate martial artists wouldn't bother learning. It was so funny that she couldn't even laugh. "Do you really not know any better martial arts than this? If you want, I can teach you. You know a lot about martial arts?" I know a little bit." "Thank you, but no thank you. Do whatever you want." Un Ha-seol scrunched up her face and went outside. Jin Muwan grinned naughtily as he watched her go, but a moment later, he resumed practicing his swordsmanship. Slash, chop, stab. In no time, his entire body was dripping with sweat. He just helped me a little, so I wanted to thank him, that's all." Un Ha-seol turned back to look at the exterior of the Grand Library. The tower was barely maintaining its original shape, just like the rest of the Northern Army fortress. She walked toward the mansion which had now become her home. Even though she could move normally now, she still hadn't been able to completely remove the poison in her body. After her strength had recovered to a certain extent, her recovery speed had slowed to a crawl. Her body was like a ceramic vase that could shatter at any moment, so she didn't dare expel the poison as the procedure would place a heavy burden on her body. "Who are you?" Un Ha-seol was lost in thought when suddenly, the voice of a stranger startled her. She turned to see Jiang Pei-san and the 3rd Company standing in the middle of the plaza. Seo Musang hadn't told the mercenaries about Un Ha-seol yet, so they had no idea she was here. He immediately whispered in Jiang Peisan's ear, telling him the stuff he'd heard about the girl from Jin Muwan. An odd light lit up in Jiang Peisan's eyes. She's Huang Qiu's niece, you say? Yes. Jiang Peisan ogled Un Hasiol's entire figure, a lecherous look on his face. Un Hasiol frowned. She felt as if 1,000 worms were crawling under her skin. How dare you? Quit staring at me like that, or you can wave your fucking eyesight goodbye. Jiang Peisan's face turned beet red. He did not expect Un Hasiol to reply in such a vulgar tone. You've got quite the mouth, girl. Don't talk to me, you horny motherfucker. I see you need some taming, you little bitch. Good. I haven't tasted the flesh of a woman for far too long. I should fix that problem right now. Ha ha ha, laughed the men of the third company, with the exception of Xiao Musang. Un Hasiol might have been a little too young for their tastes, but she was beautiful. Heck, they were so deprived, they would be satisfied with even a 60-year-old grandma. Un Hasiol could clearly see the perverted desires written all over the faces of Jiang Peisan and his men. She knew that she was in grave danger. Jiang Peisan and his lackeys slowly closed in on Un Hasiol. Xiao Musang furrowed his brows and was just about to stop them when. Suddenly, Un Hasiol moved. Swoosh! She charged at Jiang Peisan so quickly she was like a silvery white streak. In her hands, she held a small and dainty dagger. Wah! Exclaimed Jiang Peisan. Before he could react, there was already a dagger touching his neck. If Un Hasiol put any more force behind the dagger, his blood would come spurting out and he'd probably breathe his last right then and there. You. Now say it again. What you want to do to a little bitch like me? Seeing the deranged look in Un Hasiol's eyes, Jiang Peisan snapped his mouth shut like a clam. This little bitch's eyes. She's fucking insane. Jin Muwan has a few screws loose, but this girl is even worse. Captain, are you alright? Girl, how about you put that dagger away now? Looks like this bitch really wants to die. The men of the third company finally came to their senses and took out their weapons. Un Hasiol narrowed her eyes. Right now, she was in a state where she was unable to utilize her chi. If the mercenaries all ganged up on her at once, she wouldn't be able to deal with them. Thus, she had taken a gamble and chosen to first subdue Jiang Peisan. The instant they sense my weakness, they'll pounce on me like wild beasts. She understood these types of people all too well. In front of those stronger than themselves, they readily lowered their heads and licked their boots. On the other hand, when they saw someone weaker, they would latch onto them like leeches and suck them dry. Un Hasiol tightened her grip on the dagger and increased the pressure on Jiang Peisan's throat. Wait. What? Are you going to turn over a new leaf if I let you go? Do you think you can get away with killing me? There are more than 10 of us here. I don't care. What? I want to kill you. I don't care what happens afterwards. Crazy bitch. How could a little girl possibly be this insane? Jiang Peisan felt that Un Hasiol's brain wasn't normal. She was like a tiger with bared fangs. If he did anything wrong, he would die for sure. Drip, drip. Blood began to drip down Jiang Peisan's neck. The dagger had pierced through his skin. Wait. Let's make a deal. What deal? If you let me go now, I swear that I won't touch you again. And how am I supposed to believe you? I am the captain of Heaven Summit's third company. I don't tell lies. Jiang Peisan raised his voice, but the only reply he got from Un Hasiol was a snigger. She didn't believe him. However, now that the situation had gotten to this point, it was near impossible to resolve things peacefully. She really wanted to dig out Jiang Peisan's eyes, but then she would definitely be captured, raped, and killed by the others. If only my chi had recovered, trash like this would never. Eun Ha-seol weighed her options and came to a decision. She put on an act and made a cold and emotionless expression. I guess today is your lucky day. I was just wondering if I should slice off your cock. Ha! Eun Ha-seol kicked Jang Pei-san's butt and used the recoil to leap backwards. As the mercenaries rushed forward to check on Jang Pei-san's condition, she snorted coldly and left the plaza. Seo Musang clicked his tongue as he watched her go. Honestly speaking, he hadn't found her martial arts very impressive. It was the animal-like agility that took down Jang Pei-san in one move, her quick thinking, and sharp tongue that impressed him the most. Fuck. I'll definitely get back at her for this humiliation. Seo Musang heard Jang Pei-san's frenzied scream coming from behind him, but he chose to ignore it. Suddenly, one of the Grand Library's windows caught his attention. Jin Moo-won was leaning against the windowsill, watching them. You've been watching this entire scene unfold since the very beginning, haven't you? Seo Musang only managed to exchange a glance with Jin Moo-won before the young man disappeared into the shadows. Hope you are enjoying listening to The Legend of the Northern Blade. To continue this fun, visit our website theserialbinger.com for the rest of the series for free. Link to the complete series is in the comment box and the description. Like and subscribe for more content ahead.